Hello, everyone. Welcome to our last session of the Queen's Colloquium on Tax Law and Policy of this season. Great to see some faces that I haven't seen for a while. So really great to have you here. And I'm very excited to have Professor Tsilly Dagan with us today. She is the very influential scholar in our field and also, I must say, an inspiration to my own work. So I'm very pleased to have you here with us. So for this session, we have two co-hosts. We have Hassan and Agnes. They are both students in my class. And for those who are not familiar with the format, this colloquium is integrated in our tax policy class. So we have our tax policy students here with us and also external attendees. So the way we try to organize the Q&A, so Professor Dagan will present her paper, and then the way we like to organize the Q&A is the students enrolled in the class will have priority in asking their questions first, and then we move to external attendees. But if you have any questions, raise your virtual hand so we can kind of keep track of the order of questions. So with that, I'm giving the floor to Agnes.
Thank you, Mr. Ozai. I hope everyone can hear me. I also want to say hello and welcome to everybody, especially Professor Dagan. And we would like to start with a land acknowledgement. So let us acknowledge that Queens is situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory, and we are grateful to be able to live and learn on these lands. And today we'll be learning a little bit about the paper, The Myth of Tax, and discussing it with the author, Professor Tsilly Dagan. Professor Dagan is a leading scholar of domestic and international tax law, currently professor at Oxford, and her work explores tax policy and the relationship between states and markets. She is the author of International Tax Policy Between Competition and Cooperation, which she won the 2017 Franz Van Stendel Award, and she earned her LLB and SGD at Tel Aviv University and an LLM in taxation from NYU. And before joining Oxford, she taught at Bar Ilan University, where she also served as Associate Dean of Research and editor-in-chief of the Law Review, and was appointed the Raoul Wallenberg Professor of Law. And Professor Dagan has held visiting positions in Michigan, Western Ontario, and Columbia, and was part of the group on global justice at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Jerusalem. She also co-founded the Oxford Virginia Legal Dialogues and the International Tax Governance and Justice Workshop. So we would like to thank you for being here today. And also thank you for providing the paper that we'll be discussing today. It was very interesting to read. So now I'll give the floor to you to present a little bit.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the invitation and thanks for having me. And kudos for the pronunciation of all those tricky names. It's I know it's always an issue. I thought I'd share my slides and I'll speak about the paper just to get us all on track. I'm happy to take questions as I go if you have something that you'd like to ask on the go or wait for your comments and questions for after the presentation, your call. So the name, The Myth of Tax, is a tribute really to the seminal work of Leah Murphy and Tom Nagel, the myth of ownership. And it's an interesting project that is actually the result of an interesting initiative of a couple of colleagues that thought the 20th at the time, but almost the 25th anniversary of the myth of ownership is coming up. And it's a good opportunity to look back at this canonical text and try to reevaluate it some 20 some years away. And my chapter, as you could see, kind of tackles the myth of ownership from an international global perspective, but I think for our discussion, it would be interesting to take both perspective on board and discuss both the domestic significance of the project, but also the international implication, or rather the challenges. So what I thought I will do today would be to start with the main argument of the Myth of Ownership book, to explain why globalization actually challenges the very basic assumption that we can indeed redistribute through tax. I would then try and ask the question, broadly speaking, if tax doesn't work as well as we were hoping, could we or should we explore other non-tax legal tools in order to redistribute income? And this is where I touch upon both Murphy and Nagel's blind spots, but also another canonical text by Kaplan and Chauvel that actually provide the reasoning for why, in their opinion, tax should be the place for redistribution. I then move on to conclude that because tax is vulnerable in a global world due to tax competition and tax planning, and potentially other areas of law may be less vulnerable, although this is an empirical question, we need to reevaluate our way of thinking about redistribution in a global world. And then at the very end of my presentation, I'll also say a couple of words, about the mismatch between the domestic level and the global level, and the question of global justice, where there's a big discrepancy between what strong states and weak states can do in this global environment. Okay, so let's get going. First, the argument of the myth of ownership. The main argument of the myth considers, or rather reconsiders, the very baseline. So the main argument, as I said, of the myth of ownership is actually considering or reconsidering the baseline. And what Murphy and Nagel famously argue is the following, and you can see the quote up on the slide: it is logically impossible that people should have any kind of entitlement to all their pre-tax income. So the idea is that pre-tax income has no independent moral significance, and Murphy and Nagel go to a great length in explaining why this is actually the way of thinking, and I have to say I tend to agree. And if this is true, if pre-tax income has no independent moral significance, then people or taxpayers do not have a pre-political or natural right to their property, and thus when governments actually impose taxes, we cannot claim that they expropriate anything from individuals simply because people can't claim that they have pre-owned anything before the tax was imposed on them. So since there are no property rights without a state in Murphy and Nagel's view, and the reason for that in a nutshell is because there's no state without taxes, people can only be entitled to their after-tax income. And what Murphy and Nagel argue is that when we come to evaluate the system, we have to look at both property rules and tax rules together, right? And if upon reflection we find out that there are inequalities created by the system as a whole, what the tax system should do is fix them, right? So the answer, the solution in Murphy and Nagel's view is taxation. And in claiming that the response for inequality is redistribution via tax, Murphy and Nagel actually endorse the role of taxes in redistributing income. So this is their basic argument. And now enter globalization and tax competition. And what we can see is in a global world, which is not the world that Murphy and Nagel consider in their book. In a global world, the ability of states to redistribute via tax is very limited. And there are two main reasons for this limitation of the tax system. One is what I term, broadly speaking, as mobility, and the other is fragmentation. So when we talk about mobility, we talk about mobility of both resources and taxpayers, right? So resources can move, capital can move from one country to the other, economic activity can move, but also taxpayers can move, right? We can relocate, pack and go to another jurisdiction. And the mobility of resources and taxpayers puts pressure on states to lower their taxes, right? So in an effort to attract both attractive taxpayers, but mostly yielding resources, countries compete with one another and are faced with what we know as tax competition, the pressure to lower their tax rates in order to attract those resources and taxpayers. The other side of the same coin is that states are also trying to offer the most attractive public goods and services they can in order to attract those taxpayers and economic activities. They would like to attract jobs or research and development, and hence they're trying to put forward the best package of public goods and resources at the lowest tax that they can offer. The other interesting thing that happens because of competition and mobility is what I term is price discrimination. And here the interesting point is that because taxpayers are not created equal, because some taxpayers are more mobile than others, states are trying to target the more mobile among their own and foreign potential taxpayers, trying to attract the most attractive ones and the most mobile ones. Right? So the best packages and the lowest taxes are being offered to the talented, the rich, the young, and the beautiful, but also the ones that are more inclined than others to move. Okay, so we see kind of a bias of the system of the international tax of various countries in favor of the rich, talented, and young, and the opposite bias against the ones who ultimately stay behind. The other phenomenon of globalization is what I term as fragmentation. And this is the ability of taxpayers to pick and choose among various jurisdictions. So if I'm a resident of the UK, I don't have to consume all the public goods and services in the UK, especially if I'm a high net worth individual. I can use the contract laws of New York, the corporate governance rules of Delaware by incorporating there. I can register my IP in a third jurisdiction. I can invest in a fourth jurisdiction and pay taxes, if any, in an attractive location elsewhere. Right? So this is what I call fragmentation, the ability of taxpayers to mix and match jurisdictions to create the package of public goods and resources, and of course the package of taxes that is that works best for them. So whereas Murphy and Nagel say that there are no property, sorry, there's a mistake on the slide here, that there are no property rights without taxes, what we can see under globalization and fragmentation, that there are in fact property rights without taxes. Why is that the case? One, because taxpayers can opt out of the country and kind of adopt the property rules and rights of other jurisdictions, for example, by registering their IP elsewhere. And they can often do this without paying taxes in that other jurisdiction by sophisticated planning schemes. And the other thing is that they can still decide that they use their own country's property infrastructure, but they avoid taxes through tax planning. Now, obviously, this is all very tentative, right? Because we see the efforts, the great effort, I should say, of both individual countries and the global community as a whole to fight back at tax planning. And yet, I think that we are not at the stage where tax planning is obsolete, right? So I think taxpayers are still able to tax plan around a lot of the tax rules of their own jurisdiction. So altogether, both mobility and fragmentation bring us to the, or at least bring me to the conclusion, I don't know if you're convinced, but it brings me to the conclusion that there are serious limits on the ability of states to redistribute via tax, simply because states cannot collect enough taxes, and even if they can collect enough taxes, their competitive market position is such that they need to be more favorable towards the mobile, which are often the rich segments of their own communities. So if you agree with me that there are those limitations on redistribution via tax, the question arises, should we explore other non-tax tools in order to allow states to redistribute? Now, this is what I think is Murphy and Nagel's blind spot in an otherwise super rich, influential, and I should say convincing book. So Murphy and Nagel consider tax and ownership jointly when they come to evaluate inequality, right? So this is the basic idea of the book. You have to look at the system as a whole, and only after you looked at the system as a whole, you can tell us whether there are gaps or inequalities within the jurisdiction. However, when they try to look for solutions, they don't look beyond tax for a solution. So their sole solution is redistribution via tax. Now, I should note that it's not as if Murphy and Nagel consider other solutions and say they're not as good as tax and thus we vote for tax. They just don't think about this option, and they don't open the floor for opting out of the jurisdiction, tax planning, or any kind of international aspect of the tax and other legal system. Now, I have to say that, I make a big deal out of it, but in fact, Murphy and Nagel are not alone in this, right? This is the traditional view in moral philosophy, but also in law, and as I show in the paper, in economics, right? And the other canonical view is Kaplan and Chauvel's famous paper, and in that paper, Kaplan and Chauvel actually argue that, very forcefully, I should say, that tax is the place for redistribution. So they come against others who argue for redistribution via legal rules. So many people have written about how property rules should have a distributive justice component in them, how tort rules should have a distributive justice component in them, and so on and so forth. And Kaplan and Chauvel say that's the wrong way. Why is it the wrong way according to Kaplan and Chauvel? Well, Kaplan and Chauvel are both law and economics people, and for them, the one and only reason that should matter is efficiency. And they're putting a very elegant argument saying that if we were to pursue redistribution via rules other than tax, we may be facing inefficiencies. What kind of inefficiencies? One is an obvious one, saying over and under inclusion, right? So the real strong point of tax is that it can see the entire ability, the entire capacity of taxpayers, and then really put people one against the other and say, do you have greater ability or lower ability? Other rules, for example, tort rules, don't really see the entire capacity of people, but rather a very narrow perspective on what they've got. So the example they use is when the owners of a fancy yacht are involved in an accident with a poor fishing boat, right? So you see a very fancy yacht, you see a very poor or miserable fishing boat, and then if you consider distributive justice within the tort litigation, you may be inclined to have the yacht owners pay an increased sum to the owner of the fishing boat simply because they have more. But Kaplan and Javel tell us, well, you only know that they own a yacht. You don't know what else they have or don't have, and the same thing goes for the owner of the fishing boat. So you only see a very limited scope of what people have and have not. The other very interesting argument that they make for why redistributing via other, that is non-tax rules, is what they term as the double distortion argument. And I don't have the time to do justice to this argument. Let me just say very briefly, and I invite you to look at their paper if you're curious. Very briefly, what they say is that redistribution always create an incentive for people to earn less, because if you have to give part of your wealth or income to others, the incentive you have to produce such income or wealth is lower. So that's always the inefficiency of tax. But what happens if we redistribute not through tax but through other legal rules is that taxpayers are going to face a double distortion. One is the classic distortion that they may be less incentivized to work or incentivized to work less. And the other is that if they are wealthy, they may be inclined to increase their precautionary measures so that they will hopefully avoid hitting poor fishermen boats. Okay, so this is what the Kaplan called the double distortion. And the result is that if we were to apply the most efficient tort rule so as to incentivize everybody to take the ideal or the optimal precaution, and then we would collect and redistribute wealth or income through the income tax system, the result would be more efficient according to Kaplan and Chauvel. So the question that I take from that is, if states cannot effectively tax through the tax system, is the assumption of Kaplan and Chauvel and more importantly of Murphy and Nagel still valid? So should we reconsider this very elegant model by Kaplan and Chauvel? Should we reconsider the almost automatic response that redistribution should be done through the tax system because the tax system is less effective in a global world? So this is where the title of the paper comes from, The Myth of Tax. And the argument is that perhaps tax is not the magic tool that we envision it to be. Why? Because tax under globalization is highly vulnerable, both because of tax competition and because of tax planning. So countries don't have the same ability to collect taxes under competition, and taxpayers are able to opt out of the jurisdiction, and thus any effort to redistribute via tax is going to be less effective under globalization. At the same time, it doesn't mean that other areas are necessarily less vulnerable, right? But this is not something we can preclude just by assumption, because we do see interjurisdiction competition in other areas of law, right? We see interjurisdiction competition in corporate governance or in bankruptcy rules. We see people trying to jurisdiction shop between different jurisdictions. And we do know that there are choice of law mechanisms that allow people to pick and choose among those jurisdictions. And those of you who are unfamiliar with Katerina Pistor's wonderful book, The Code of Capital, I highly recommend looking at this. So Pistor actually describes how family office kind of try to help their clients, which are always high net worth individuals, in picking and choosing among different jurisdictions the legal system that would fit their clients the most. So it's like a tailor-made legal system that is made, expertly made, I should say, by legal and tax planners, right? So the basic argument is not that other areas are necessarily better than tax law in redistribution, but rather that tax is not necessarily superior to other areas, and that this is, in fact, an empirical question. So we should look at all the options and try to evaluate where's the best place to redistribute. So why do I think tax might still be more vulnerable? One reason is I think in the past few years, we see quite vigorous, I would say, tax competition. And I think just by looking at the efforts of the global community to curtail this competition, we can say that, this was something that was brought up to the agenda of the political leaders of states, but for a good reason, right? Because tax competition was very much affecting their tax policies. The same, I think we can say about tax planning, right? So despite the BEPS effort that I think did a very good job in curtailing tax evasion, I think tax avoidance is still something that we cannot ignore. Now, it may be the case that we see similar efforts to opt out of system in contract laws, in corporate governance, and so on and so forth. We definitely have to look at these and try to evaluate whether these are as bad as in tax or not. But my sense, and again, I'm happy to hear other views on this, my sense is that at least currently, competition in other areas is still less fierce than in tax. And it may be just the case that tax competition is more salient than other areas, that we see more of it, that we hear more of it. But in fact, if you look at the facts on the ground, we'll see that tax competition is alive and kicking in other areas as well. The other, again, gut feeling I have more than anything is that there are less options to opt out of the jurisdiction in other areas, in non-tax areas, without relocating. So if I own property in Canada, for example, it will be somewhat harder for me to opt for the rules of other jurisdictions without actually relocating. Although, again, for high net worth individuals, I think that their physical presence is not really a consideration as to which jurisdiction they hold their property in. Now, another important point is that whatever the situation is currently, it may change, right? So if we put more pressure on redistribution through property rules or through zoning rules or through bankruptcy rules or contract rules, we may change the focus or shift the focus of taxpayers to these areas, and they will try to plan more around their operations in these areas simply because the costs will be such that it will be worth it for them to actually plan around those areas in similar ways that they do in tax laws. So that's the basic argument. Now, a couple of points I point to in the conclusion. How are we doing on time? Do we still have time, or is it time to stop?
We're good. We're good. Yeah, I think you can finish.
Okay, so very briefly. One is a very basic mismatch that I speak about in this paper, but I think it's a more general point that we can see in many other areas. And this is what I term as the national versus global mismatch. So whereas states operate on the national level because sovereign states are applying their sovereign power to their own citizens and their own territory, people and markets more generally operate on a global level, right? And this mismatch create the current stage of today, where states are no longer the ones that have exclusive control over their citizenry. Instead, a state that at least according to Murphy and Nagel, can and should mix and match regulation of ownership and tax in order to promote distributive justice, right? That this is their vision. In fact, cannot do that. And what we're seeing is that individuals are the ones who can mix and match their interactions with multiple jurisdictions. So the assumption that taxes are necessarily a part of the ownership system, and that's again the assumption of Murphy and Nagel, is seriously undermined under globalization. So that's the first general point I wanted to make. The other general point that I think it's important to pay attention to is the point of global justice, again, something that Ivan and myself have been working extensively on. And very broadly speaking, again, it is the gap between strong states and weak states, right? States in demand and states in less demands. You know, some people would call them developed and developing countries, North and South, no matter how you want to frame it. The fact of the matter is that there are some states that are in higher demand among taxpayers than others. So taxpayers who are interested in living in an attractive state because of the public goods and services that such state provides, perhaps because of the level of education or the business environment, or you name it, each of us with their own preferences. People will be willing to pay more for their involvement or residency in such a state. And such states that are what I term as stickier, right? People will be less of an incentive to opt out of the state if they don't like the tax rules, will be in a stronger position to impose a personal-based worldwide tax system, right? And a famous or infamous example is the US citizenship-based taxation. Right? So the US still insists on taxing its citizens worldwide, irrespective of the fact of whether or not they reside in the US. Now, some people may say that the US is playing with fire here, that, if it pushes too strongly, people will repatriate, as many of them do in recent years. But so far, the numbers are such that I don't see an inclination within the US government to renege on the taxation of citizens, even if they don't reside in the country. Other countries may impose stronger residency-based taxation. The UK, for example, has recently walked back on its very old tradition of the non-dom regime and kind of established a long-term residency category that actually tails people for years after they moved out of the UK. Very interestingly, we'll see how that holds up. Other states that are in less demand, the ones that people don't really find very attractive, if they impose such a tax system and if they try to impose a residence-based redistribution system on the worldwide income of the residents or citizens, may simply see or encounter the risk of exit. People may just pack and go because they will be unwilling to pay those high taxes. So these are my 2 points for at the end of the paper. And just to conclude, I think that the myth of ownership convincingly suggested that we should demystify ownership or property rights and stop treating them as a given baseline. What I try to suggest in this paper is that we do the same for tax, that we recognize that states' power to tax is limited under globalization, and that we should no longer treat the coercive power of the state to tax as the sole mechanism to deal with redistribution. Rather, we should look at other legal mechanisms and add them to the bank of potential policies that could be used for redistribution. Thank you.